Hello, y'all. Here we are back again for our content review of Historical Period 3 for the APUSH exam. As the slide that you're looking at indicates, this is the first historical period that is sort of fair game for any of the time periods on the test. And in fact, it does show up very frequently on the writing portion of the exam, especially in SAQs and LEQs. And it's also fair game for the DBQs and multiple choice as well. Our beginning and ending dates here, 1754 indicates that we are starting this historical period by talking about the French and Indian War. That is the start date for the fighting of the French and Indian War in North America. And the end date of 1800 indicates that we are ending at the election of Jefferson in 1800, which is also called by historians sometimes the, quote, revolution of 1800, because it indicated such a significant kind of turning point in early American political history. So because this is one of our more focused and tested on units, you're going to see throughout here the key concepts as we go through. You should always feel free to pause the screen, take a look at them, but I do, as always, definitely recommend that you have a copy of the course and exam description and or the key concepts up and available. So first off, this unit starts with, again, the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. Keep in mind that 7 Years' War is the sort of name for the global conflict, and then French and Indian War is the name for the part of it that's happening in North America specifically, which is longer than 7 years. Yay. We're looking specifically at causes and effects here. So first up, causes. If we take a look at the slide here, we can see the causes pretty clearly from the map, right? The setup that we have here in 1750 before the war starts is the British in yellow controlling Canada and then the 13 colonies, and the French kind of in between them in pink around the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River. And you can see where the sort of striped yellow and pink are on the map. That is the area where the French and British are going to come into conflict, right? The British are pushing west. The French are looking to hold their claims to this territory. The conflict starts right around where like the modern day city of Pittsburgh is. So that's sort of like where this is. The College Board and geographers refer to that as the Ohio River Valley because it's the valley around the Ohio River. And so this kicks off this long conflict, which, like I said, is happening both here in North America and also all over the world. Britain and France are fighting in India. They're fighting in other parts of Europe. There's some fighting that goes on in Africa. So this is an extensive sort of like colonial land war that's going on all over the world. You don't need to know about a ton about the fighting or any specific battles or anything like that. Mostly you just need to know a little bit about the impacts. So here is the best way to sort of see what the impacts are. This is our before map, right? This is what things looked like in 1750. And then when the war ends with the Treaty of Paris of 1763, there's a couple treaties of Paris. The one at the end of the French and Indian War is the Treaty of Paris of 1763. This is what the map looks like. So again, we go from this before the war to this after the war. Before, after, before, after. So what you can see really clearly is that this is a big loss for the French, who lose almost all of their North American territory. They only retain what is Haiti today, was called Saint-Domingue, the French colony of Saint-Domingue. And the British are the big winners here. They took all of what had been, or almost all of what had been New France. Some of the stuff that they don't want, they sort of push off over onto Spain. Spain is involved in the war in a way that you don't really need to know a ton about. So you can see their involvement here a little bit. But for the most part, the British now control everything east of the Mississippi River. Now, in reality, they haven't settled most of that territory, and we'll talk about how that goes. But this is the sort of the big victory for the British. They are now officially like the most dominant empire globally, because they win here and they win in a bunch of other places. So the Treaty of Paris, in many ways, is like a big victory, right, for the British. But it also comes with some downsides for the British themselves, who have had to pay a whole bunch of money and are now in quite a bit of debt, and also for some other groups that the College Board would like you to know about. Group number one, heavily impacted by this, is Native Americans. The vast majority of Native Americans in the kind of like impacted areas of North America had sided with the French. This is mostly because the French had historically been much more willing to kind of work like collegially with Native American tribes. This doesn't mean the French were perfect or that they were, so friendly all the time, but they definitely had a more the cooperative, I guess, relationship with Native Americans than the British settlers did. Remember that the British pretty much just want Native Americans off the land, whatever that looks like. So there were some tribes that sided with the British. The Oneida, for example, who were part of the Iroquois Confederacy, did. But for the most part, most of the Native American tribes sided with the French. And when the French lost, the Treaty of Paris that we just talked about on the previous slide did not include the Native Americans at all. There were like no Native representatives or anything like that. And so, of course, as British settlers start to sort of push out and stream into this territory that had been New France, Native Americans are going to resist that, right, in several different ways. Most famously, as soon as the French and Indian War ends, 1763, the same year the French and Indian War ends, we see a big uprising. It's usually called Pontiac's Rebellion. Chief Pontiac was chief of a tribe called the Ottawa, sort of based in the kind of like Detroit, like Lake Michigan area, and you can see on the map there, like roughly where this is. And this is a very like bloody and intense conflict that causes a lot of loss of life for British settlers, British soldiers, and it's really going to make the British government pretty wary of like essentially starting up a whole another round of wars with these Native Americans in particular. It doesn't make the British settlers, aka Americans, quite as wary, but the British government is basically like, oh, okay, we just finished this big long war with the French, can we just like pause for a sec and let us recover from that. So they're going to look to essentially kind of like accommodate Native American demands and to restrict settler settlement with the proclamation of 1763, which we'll talk a little bit more about in just a sec. So that's impact of the French and Indian War on Native Americans. The other impact, of course, in addition to the British and the Native Americans, is the impact on the colonies or the colonists themselves. So a couple of things going on here. Number one, this is one of the first things that like colonists have been involved in that involved colonists from all 13 colonies. So it's kind of like a unifying or like an identity creating experience in some ways. Not for everybody, but certainly for people who were involved, it is unifying. And it's also kind of an anti-British moment for a lot of people in the colonies because colonial soldiers fought alongside British redcoats or British soldiers in the French and Indian War, and they did not like each other. They did not get along. The styles of the colonial militias and the British army, the British sort of like professional, right, army, do not mesh very well. They have very kind of like opposing styles of discipline and ways of fighting. So a lot of colonists come out of the French and Indian War being like, oh, like, you know, I mean, I think of myself as British, but I'm not British like those guys, right? It's really kind of like an alienating experience from the British Empire for many of the colonial soldiers. The other big thing I think most famously that people are usually most familiar with, of course, is that the French and Indian War does lead the British into debt, which means that they are going to start trying to squeeze more money out of their colonies, right, to compensate for that debt. So those are some of the impacts on the American colonies. One sort of piece of specific information that I think kind of highlights some of what we're talking about in here and that has made an appearance in multiple choice questions in the past is something that happens right at the beginning of the French and Indian War. So 1754, the same year that the fighting starts with George Washington and Fort Necessity, there is a kind of continental congress essentially where delegates from a bunch of different colonies meet together. One of them is Ben Franklin. He's there representing Pennsylvania. And Franklin proposes what he calls the Albany Plan of Union, which would have been this sort of very loose kind of like quasi-government organization, actually very similar to what we eventually get with the Articles of Confederation. This was kind of like a prototype of that, where there was sort of like a loose government, I guess, but not really a government, more for the purposes of organizing like a unified army for defense against like the French and then the sort of Indian allies of the French themselves. So Franklin's proposal was like, hey, colonies, you know, fellow colonists, let's unite for our self-defense. And the round response from like every other representative, including the other Pennsylvanians, is like, no, like, we are not doing that, right? We had Pennsylvania and like New York joining together, like, psh, no, right? So what the Albany Plan of Union shows, and what you can use it as evidence of, is it shows that when the French and Indian War started, that the 13 colonies still viewed themselves as very separate. They did not see themselves as the 13 colonies, like a meaningful unit. They definitely did not see themselves as Americans, right, in a meaningful way. They saw themselves as Pennsylvanian and British, or North Carolinian and British, right, or a Rhode Islander and British. They had the British identity and they had their colonial identity, but they didn't have sort of like a unified, you know, American identity yet. So the sort of thing that you need to be able to trace from 1754 onward is how do we get from that place where the Albany Plan of Union is rejected to a place where enough Americans feel unified enough to declare war and sign the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which is not that far off, right? 1754 to 1776 is not that long. So one of the things that the College Board wants you to be able to trace is this sort of growth of like American identity, and we'll be touching on that in the next few slides. So coming into the Road to the Revolution, sort of two key concepts that really highlight Road to the Revolution stuff here, 3.3 and 3.4, which talk both about the events and also about sort of like changes in attitudes and things of that nature that you need to know a little bit about. So first up, if you want to really be sort of like a step ahead of other test takers, it's really good to know a little bit about essentially some of the things that colonists are upset about that aren't taxes, right? Because everybody knows, like, oh, taxes, that's the cause of the American Revolution. But there's other things going on too. And And what the kind of like header that the College Board gives these things is that these are the attempts of the British government to assert their imperial authority, something that they have traditionally either not done or not really followed through on in the past. So we are an empire, right? We control you. You should do what we say. Remember that starting in about 1690, the British government had been trying to implement and then enforce navigation acts, but they had been really inconsistent. They would like implement a new navigation act, and then the colonists would smuggle, and then they would just kind of give up for a little while, right? Or, etc. So there hadn't really been any consistent enforcement of any British imperial authority up to this point. But that all changes after the French and Indian War, right? 1763, really big turning point for sort of British imperial authority. A couple of examples. Number one, passing the Proclamation of 1763. I just mentioned this briefly earlier. What the Proclamation of 1763 is it's a law passed by the British Parliament that says that American settlers cannot settle west of the Proclamation line of 1763, which is an imaginary line that basically goes down the Appalachian Mountains. So it sort of traces down the Appalachian Mountains. You'll see this on maps sometimes. Not a real line, not a wall, not a fence or anything like that. Just the British government saying, like, here's a line in the sand. Settlers don't go past this, basically because we don't want to deal with it. If you go out there, you're going to get into a fight with Native Americans. You're going to come crying to us to help you. And, like, we don't have the time or the money to deal with that. So as part of this sort of appeasement post-Pontiac Rebellion, the British try to limit colonial settlement, and the colonists do not like this. As far as they are concerned, they just fought and died for 7 years, right, plus, against the French to win this land, and now they're being told that they can't take this, money, basically, right? As land is money in this time period. So as far as they're concerned, this feels very unfair, right? Like they're being denied their rights. The other kind of category of stuff that British colonists are upset about that's not quite taxes has to do with the fact that the British government basically decides to crack down on smuggling, right? Smuggling is illegally importing goods without paying taxes, Navigation Act taxes on them. Colonists have been doing it forever, as long as the Navigation Acts have been around. And now the British are really going to step up enforcement using what are called customs officials. Customs is an old-fashioned name for taxes, right? So you'll see customs or imposts or duties are all kind of like terms that were used in this time period for different types of taxes. Two examples on here of ways that the British attempt to enforce smuggling that are really unpopular. One is through writs of assistance, which were those blank check search warrants that we talked about, where any customs official with this writ of assistance could go into any building, any house, any bar, any shop, and do any kind of searching that they wanted, any kind of damage that resulted they weren't responsible for, and they could pass it off to anybody that they wanted to deputize. So they really sort of like open blank check search warrants, very unpopular. And then the next one down, the Admiralty and Vice Admiralty courts were two different kinds of naval courts, where the British government basically said, well, if you're getting charged with smuggling, we're not going to let you get tried in the regular criminal court in, let's say, Massachusetts, because they're too friendly, like they're too lenient on smuggling. So instead, you will have to go get tried in these British naval courts, which are much stricter, which don't have juries, crucially, which only have like an admiral or vice admiral, right, sitting as judge, and they're not here. They're not here in the United States. You have to, well, not here in the colonies. You have to get on ship and you have to go all the way to, whatever, London, right, or wherever they're being held around the British Empire to sort of have your day in court. The writs of assistance and Admiralty and Vice Admiralty courts are direct causes of parts of the Bill of Rights. Like the writs of assistance are why we have protections about search warrants as one of the rights in the Bills of Rights. And the Admiralty and Vice Admiralty courts are why there is specific language that you have a right to a trial by a jury of your peers in the Bill of Rights as well. So these are great examples of the connection between essentially kind of colonial grievances and then the eventual documents that we get out of this. So those are some examples of like non-tax things that the colonists are upset about. But of course, a major thing that colonists are going to be upset about, not all of them, but a lot of them, are taxes. You don't need to know all of the taxes, but you do need to know a few, and I would definitely suggest the Stamp Act as one of them. This is the first British attempt to pass a direct tax on the colonists, so not like an import tax or a tariff, right, but a tax that colonists are paying like at the register. The Stamp Act is not a tax on stamps. Students get that wrong all the time. Be very careful about it. The Stamp Act is not a tax on stamps. It's a tax on paper. And you put the stamp on it to show that you've paid the tax, right? It's like a little, like, yeah, you paid it. Any sort of official paper, wills, governing documents, business contracts, dice, playing cards, right? And pretty much anything that they thought they could get away with was covered under the Stamp Act. It was very, very unpopular, especially in cities. You're in the rural farming area, maybe it's not that big of a deal to you. You don't sign a lot of legal documents, but if you live in like Boston or Philadelphia, this is a big deal, and it's going to really impact your business and potentially your wealth. This is where we see the sort of pattern card of colonial resistance start. The first actions by groups calling themselves Sons of Liberty, the first kind of like protests against tax collectors, sort of focusing on tax collectors and doing things like hanging them in effigy or threatening, tarring and feathering, throwing rotten fruit at them, those types of things. The colonies also write official formal protests to Parliament, basically saying like, please rethink this policy. Like, this isn't good. We can't do this. We don't have the money to pay this tax. The House of Burgesses in particular sends some of these. And if you read them or if you get them as documents, you'll notice that they're still pretty polite at this point. Like, they're mad, but they're not like, I guess, disrespectful, right, in a modern sense yet. It's still very much like, we are loyal British citizens, but we don't think that this is like right, basically. And you'll see that attitude and that language change as the later that we get on the road to the revolution. So the Stamp Act crisis is a good specific thing to know. Some other kind of like general changes that are happening across the, roughly 10, 12 years or so of the road to the revolution. There is colonial resistance, and then there's also ideological changes. Oops, I got my headers flipped here. Just sort of flip those headers. At the top up there are some examples of colonial resistance. So I just mentioned the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. These are loosely organized groups, mostly middle class and upper class led, right? People like Sam Adams and Paul Revere were sort of well-off merchants and lawyers. They held public protests, sometimes anonymously, sometimes kind of under their own identities, pinning demands to trees and holding protests outside of tax collectors' offices, those types of things. We also see what's called the non-importation movement. That is just a fancy name for a boycott. So when we see the British put taxes on things, we will see colonial groups responding by refusing to buy those things, tea, of course, being the most notable. And then another good example of colonial resistance, again, we're swapping those two headings, is that we start to see the colonies really for the first time making an effort to communicate with each other. So like Pennsylvania with Rhode Island and New York and, Georgia or whomever. First through what are called committees of correspondence. These are just literal committees inside of the colonial legislatures that form with the goal of like writing letters and being like, hey, here's what's going on in like Massachusetts. Like, what are you doing about this in, New York or et cetera, right? So there's correspondence back and forth between the colonies. And then eventually, of course, we're going to get meetings, what we call continental congresses, the first and the second continental congress. So there's some examples of colonial resistance up at the top. Down at the bottom, again, swapping the headings, we have ideological arguments, sort of changes in like the rhetoric, if you're taking AP Lang, about the way that colonists are talking about themselves and about the British. Lots of this comes from the Enlightenment, right? So these are sort of ideas that have been seeded for decades at this point. In particular, we see a lot of discussion from colonists about what they feel are their natural rights as like human beings, and also what they feel are their rights as British citizens. Most of the especially early language is that the problem here, the reason why the revolution eventually is going to be justified, is because we are British citizens, we have rights as British citizens, and Parliament and then eventually the King are taking those rights away. They're ignoring or sort of trampling on our rights. So this idea of rights that the Crown is overstepping is a central kind of piece of rhetoric that we will see growing. We also see in justification of the revolution, again, a growing discussion of and eventually calls for this idea of a social contract, right? The idea that the government has a contract with the people give up some of their powers to the government, in exchange the government promises to protect them and uphold their rights. And if the government's not doing that, which the colonists argue the British Crown isn't, then rebellion is like essentially it's the right thing to do, right? It's sort of the correct response to sort of overthrow a government that's not holding up its end of the contract. Other kind of like arenas of debate or discussion, ideological debate or discussion, the sort of classic way that British Parliament was understood in the British Empire was through something called virtual representation, which basically meant that not every single like area or town or county throughout like the British Empire as a whole had a direct representative the way that we have in our Congress, where it's like if you live in this town, then there's like somebody who represents your geographical area. Instead, the idea was just that, well, like the people in Parliament just sort of represent all British people. That's sort of like virtually represented, right? The colonists increasingly are going to call for or to rail against what they call taxation without representation. This idea that like, sure, you say we're represented in Parliament, but there's nobody from the colonies there, so like, how can that really be true? Lastly, and this calls back to what I was talking about a little bit on the previous slide, is that increasingly, we are going to see some of the loudest voices of the revolution, people like John Adams, for example, claiming not just a British identity, but an identity as a patriot, right, or American. And that is definitely something that is in existence at the time of like the declaration when the Revolutionary War starts. But I think it's debatable or arguable like to what extent it existed and for whom it existed as well. Because again, we're talking about sort of our loudest and most vocal voices who are talking about American as something sort of separate from British. With all of that said, that's just sort of like a big overview of the things that you need to know about the road to the revolution. It's not a bad idea to know some of the other events. It is not so important to know exactly what year things happened, but it can be useful to know the order that they happened in. And this is a good area sometimes for sort of like specific study. I'm going to do like a speed run version of the events that are on this slide here. And if you feel like you need a little bit more, highly recommend like the crash course video on this. So we had the Proclamation Line of 1763. Again, that's right after the French and Indian War. That's followed by the Stamp Act, which we were just talking about, direct tax on on paper goods and paper products. After the Stamp Act crisis, Parliament shoots itself in the foot a little bit by repealing the Stamp Act, which teaches the colonists that they were right about this whole thing. But Parliament is not giving up on the idea of taxing the colonists. They want to show that, like, okay, the Stamp Act was bad and it didn't work, but you do still have to pay taxes. So they come back with the Townshend Acts. These are indirect taxes, tariffs on paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea, all things that are generally imported directly from Great Britain, and the colonists respond with the first non-importation movement, so that boycott that I was talking about. To enforce the Townshend Acts, the British send in first waves more tax collectors, like thousands more tax collectors to the major cities, and then secondly, and when there's resistance to those tax collectors, they send in a bunch of soldiers, about 3,000, I think, 3,000, 4,000 British redcoats, who are there not to protect the colonists, but to police them. It is that group of soldiers who arrive in the colonies, I think in like 1768 or 1769, who are going to be the centerpiece of the famous Boston Massacre. This is a common mistake that students make. The Boston Massacre seems like something that should happen really close to the Revolution, but it's actually about 5 years, 6 years really before things get started. So the Boston Massacre, which involves a group of British soldiers opening fire on a protesting group of Bostonians, and then the subsequent trial of the British soldiers in Boston court. In the period after the Boston Massacre is really when we see those committees of correspondence that I talked about develop. Not every single one of the colonies, but most of them have committees of correspondence by the time that we get to the Tea Act in 1773, so in those intervening like 3 years. The holdout, by the way, in a lot of this is going to be Georgia, which is by far our most loyalist colony. So in 1773, the British Parliament again is like, okay, this is not working. The Townshend Acts are not working too. So they basically repeal all of the Townshend Acts and then sort of renew the biggest and most central one, which is the tax on tea. So now it's got its own act, right, the Tea Act, which in theory at least should lower the price of tea because they're doing sort of a fancy thing where they kind of like cut out the middleman. They're trying to sort of make a statement, right, that the colonists will sort of pay these taxes and we can make them do it. Of course, when the first ships full of this taxed tea arrive in the Boston Harbor, they sit in Boston Harbor for several days as colonists refuse to offload them. And then we have the very famous Boston Tea Party, where groups of identified with the Sons of Liberty sneak on board, toss probably about $1 million worth of tea into the Boston Harbor. It's pretty significant property damage. In response to that, the Boston Tea Party incident, the British Parliament is like, cool, the city of Boston is a bunch of criminals and they're housing criminals, and so we will punish you until you give up like the doers of the Boston Tea Party. And this is what's called the Intolerable Acts, or sometimes the Coercive Acts. This is a series of acts that revoke the Massachusetts Charter, dismantle Massachusetts courts. This is all really significant, but really significant is that it shuts down Boston Harbor, so no ships in, no ships out of Boston Harbor. It's sort of like blockades the harbor itself, again, until sort of like the perpetrator, like the money is paid back basically for the Boston Tea Party damage. In response to this, we get the First Continental Congress. This is the first attempt at a meeting of delegates of all of the colonies. 12 of the 13 colonies show up. Georgia is the holdout. And they don't quite, like, they're still not quite there even at this point. Right, they send a strongly worded letter to the king for the first time, not to Parliament, but to the king, being like, hey, like, what's going on? Let's fix this, please. And they also say, like, okay, we are going to say in a year, we're going to meet again in a year. This is 1774. And if things aren't, Yeah, 1774. And if things are not better in a year, then we're going to have to take some sort of more drastic action. So this First Continental Congress is kind of like a setup meeting. But before that year can elapse, before the Second Continental Congress is scheduled to meet, the war breaks out in the Boston area, right, where most of the troops were stationed. This is Lexington and Concord in the spring of 1775. It's really useful for you to know that the first shots of the war are fired before the Declaration of Independence, and that in the next, I think it's like a month and a half later, when the Second Continental Congress is scheduled to meet finally, the question is now basically, is this a rebellion in Boston, or are these other colonies joining in to support this? And this is now like a war, right? A war for independence and a rebellion. And we don't really finally make that determination until July of 1776, when the Declaration of Independence is signed, just as the British ships are heading for New York. If you're a Hamilton fan, this is where we join Hamilton in progress. So again, that's just a quick rundown there. As far as the Revolutionary War itself, this slide, like this key concept that's on here, really is like what you need to know about the Revolutionary War itself. Just a couple of terms in here that I want to highlight in particular. The College Board and I would like you to know that there is never a point in the Revolution where all of the colonists are united behind the revolutionary cause. There are always a portion who are what we call loyalist, which means loyal to the British. As you can see on the slide, that's anywhere between 10 and 30% of colonists. When the war starts, like at the time of the Declaration of Independence, is probably about 30% or about 33, so about a third of colonists. By the end of the war, it's probably down to about 10%, but that's still a pretty significant chunk of people. And after the war, lots of loyalists leave. Many of them go to Canada, some of them go to Great Britain, some of them go to the British West Indies, some of them stay. But so there is always, like, there's never a point in the war, no matter what you're talking about, where there's not loyalists going on. Another good term to know, the term for the army that, like the first U.S. Army, right, the army that the colonists kind of call up, they call it the Continental Army. So if you ever run into a document and it's talking about the Continental Army, you know that you're looking at a Revolutionary War thing. And the last sort of specific war piece on here is the only real battle name that I would suggest that you know is the Battle of Saratoga. This happens in 1777, pretty early in the war, but it's considered a major turning point because it's the first big colonial Continental Army victory of the war, like as far as a big pitched battle. And as a result, it convinces the French to join an alliance with us, to give us money, and eventually, very importantly, ships, which we will use at the Battle of Yorktown to defeat the British. So very, very key. We could not have won the Revolutionary War without the French alliance, so that's a big one. So that's the war. The other kind of thing that comes up about the Revolutionary War sometimes from the College Board is essentially like the impacts of the war. Down here at the bottom, where I just kind of moved myself, you'll notice that it's good to know that it has global impacts. So our revolution is really the first of these kind of like democratic, small r Republican, right, revolutions, and it kicks off a series of others. The French Revolution starts in 1789. That's the same year that George Washington becomes president. The Haitian Revolution, the revolution to create an independent Haiti, starts at roughly the same time, about a year or so later. And then a whole series of revolutions in Latin America against Spanish and Portuguese government that kick off in kind of like the early 1800s. Mexico becomes independent in 1821, for example. And all of those places that I just mentioned are going to wind up with governments that are somewhat patterned after the American government that we are going to talk about building here in just a sec. So that's a good thing to know. Other thing up here more at the top is the impacts of the American Revolution on sort of different sectors of society. So a few of those here in future slides. Firstly, impact of the American Revolution on African Americans or on sort of slavery more broadly. I think that a lot of people hoped that it would have more of an impact than it did. The only government that winds up offering freedom for fighting in the Revolution is the British. None of the colonial governments offer like broad offer of freedom. But in 1775, a colonial governor of the Royal Governor of Virginia, who's a guy named Lord Dunmore, issues a proclamation where he basically says, enslaved people, indentured servants, if you flee your patriot masters and come fight with the British, when we inevitably win, you will be free. That's very popular, and lots of them do. There are fairly sizable contingents of black loyalists. We think, I've seen numbers somewhere like 30,000 to 50,000. Colonel Ty is probably the most famous. That's who's depicted on the slide here. So that obviously doesn't go well for them, right, as the British don't wind up winning, but that is, again, a good example of an impact here. As far as impact more broadly on the free black community, not a ton. Some of them are Revolutionary War soldiers, and it has, that type of impact on them. And then on the institution of slavery, a little bit of ideological impact. Biggest things are that this is really when we see some states, not all of them, some of these brand new states that used to be colonies starting to outlaw slavery. So if you look at the little chart that's here, you can see Pennsylvania does basically during the Revolution, Massachusetts right at the end, New Hampshire same year, Connecticut and Rhode Island within a year, right? Sort of even in the Articles of Confederation period, right? Even before the Constitution is written. So we do see some states abolishing slavery. That's a pretty big deal. I think more directly or more significantly, maybe, more impactfully, is that what the revolution provides is it provides a lot of like rhetoric and argumentation that is going to encourage like calls for abolition among abolitionist groups, right? Free blacks, enslaved people. We're going to see a big uptick in things like petitions being written to state legislatures, being like, what about natural rights? Like, shouldn't we be free too, or shouldn't we have the right to vote too, right? Or whatever the case may be. So the biggest impact on the institution of slavery that the revolution has is, I would say, like an ideological one. It's going to form the basis of most of the abolitionist arguments that we will see being built in the early 1800s. Another group the College Board wants you to know a little bit about, impact of the revolution on women. This is another one where it's kind of like a little bit. Lots of later wars, there is a very distinct like the war causes this to happen. Like in World War I is a pretty big cause of the passage of the suffrage amendment. World War II has a very direct and kind of long-term impact on women in the workforce, increasing women in the workforce. Other wars, though, have a lot of impact during the war, like women have to take on sort of positions, extra responsibilities during the war, but they're not necessarily longer lasting. And I would put the Revolutionary War more in that category, the Civil War too. The one thing that does come out of it is this idea of Republican motherhood, which is a very frequent specific term from the College Board. It's in one of the key concepts. Republican motherhood is the idea basically that they're in a republic, smaller republic, this new type of government trying to found, there is a role for women that they should be educated so that they can themselves then have, and teach educated children, because we need to have citizens who are educated so they can vote for their leaders and have input into their government. This is one of those kind of like, again, like 50-50 things. It's like a significant role for women. Yay! That role is teaching your children. Oh, like it's still sort of within the domestic sphere, right? Very common error that I see students make is trying to continue Republican motherhood for too long. This is a term that you should really only apply basically during this historical period, kind of through the very early 1800s. As the cult of domesticity rises in the early 1800s, Republican motherhood declines, right? The two do not really overlap for very long. So you do not want to be talking about Republican motherhood in like the 1900s, right, on an essay. Just be careful about that. Last group as well that we need to check in on as far as impacts of the revolution, Native Americans. This is another bad one. Pretty much the same thing that we talked about with the French and Indian War. Interestingly, in this conflict, the majority of the Native American tribes that wind up taking sides between the colonists and British side with the British. You might be like, well, why did they just sided against them, 20 years ago in the French and Indian War, but this time the British are the best of two bad options, because at least they're far away, and they've demonstrated some willingness to try to restrain their colonists with the proclamation of 1763. But the British, no more than the French, they don't include the Native Americans in any of the negotiations at the end of the war. The treaty that ends the American Revolution is another Treaty of Paris, French and Indian War, Treaty of Paris, 1763, Revolutionary War, Treaty of Paris, 1783, right? They're 20 years apart. And this one also doesn't include any concessions for Native Americans, lots of whom will pack up and move up to Canada. And it's going to kick off a whole new wave of quote unquote Indian wars, right, is the term that we use for this sort of rolling series of wars against various tribes that the United States government engages in for like the next 100 years. And we'll talk more about those in just a sec. So that's Native Americans. Next kind of era or area up is what's historians sometimes call the critical period. This is a period between the end of the Revolutionary War and then the creation of the Constitution. It's about 10 years or so. And it includes the period basically when the United States is governed by the Articles of Confederation. And, don't lose sight of this, not just the Articles of Confederation, also by new state governments. And those two things, the Articles of Confederation and new state governments, are the first examples of governments anywhere in the modern world founded under these small r Republican ideals. And I'm saying small r here because we're talking about republic, the concept of a type of government without a king, not republic like the modern day Republican Party, right? There's different things here. So Republican ideals or republicanism, this is another one where you need to know what this is. Like if the College Board asks you to talk about how Republican ideals influenced, colonists' desire to resist British imperial authority, like you need to have an example or two of a Republican ideal. It's mostly stuff that you learned about in civics or gov last year. It's things like government by consent of the governed, checks and balances, frequent elections. You can see this sort of snap of the slide that we used to discuss these all the way back in like October when we talked about this in class. class. And it's good to be aware that the various governing documents that are produced in this time period are all just basically like different attempts to kind of play out, like, what do Republicans, okay, so you have this ideal, right, government by consent of the governed. What does that actually look like in a governing document, like practically? So the documents that are up here are all good examples of different attempts, documents that include some of these Republican ideals in them. We already talked about the Albany Plan of Union, which would have been a loose confederation that was rejected. The Declaration of Independence is not a governing document, it's a statement of independence, but it does include a lot of Republican ideals in it, especially, again, the idea of government by consent of the governed. And then we really start to get into it when we hit the creation of the state constitutions, which start as soon as the Declaration of Independence is signed and continue throughout the Revolutionary War. If you remember talking about Massachusetts and Virginia in particular as good examples of like pattern state constitutions to take a look at. At the federal level, we have the Articles of Confederation and then the Constitution, right, as the two big governing documents that are taking different tacts at sort of like putting Republican ideals into practice. First up, the Articles of Confederation. You need to know a little bit about the Articles of Confederation, especially about the weaknesses, some of the things that don't go quite so well, so you can kind of survey the stuff on this slide. We usually really drag the Articles of Confederation. They do not go well, but it's worth noting, like, this is the government that wins the war, and it does have some benefits to it. There's some things that go well, but overall it is a very weak government. It's not strong enough to control the states. We have all sorts of problems where states are like declaring war on each other because they're trying to tax each other. If you remember that whole thing with like New York and New Jersey, if they have no executive, there's no courts. There's just the state courts, right? There's no federal courts. They cannot tax. They cannot raise an army, and the states are kind of running amok. The sort of tipping point that I think finally convinces a lot of leading, I was going to say colonists, but now Americans, leading Americans, that the Articles of Confederation are not working is Shays' Rebellion. If you remember, this is the rebellion of poor farmers in western Massachusetts, most of whom were like veterans of the Continental Army who were in debt and who were being taxed by the state of Massachusetts to pay off their war debts and were being thrown into debtor's prison when they couldn't pay their taxes. So this is like it's very similar to, like Bacon's Rebellion or some of the other ones that we've talked about where it's like a class rebellion, right? Poor versus rich. And this was the one where, because most of the guys in Shays' Rebellion make up the Massachusetts state militia, there really was no like army that could put this down. We can't call up an army. The Articles of Confederation can't do that. And so it winds up being put down by like a hired mercenary army that like 6 of the wealthiest like Massachusetts residents wind up like pooling their money and hiring this private army. And that's not great, right? That's like feudal Japan. That's not a good sign. So a lot of leading Americans who were like, well, we don't really want too strong of a government. We want to make sure that the states, have more power. A lot of them saw Shays' Rebellion and were like, oopsie, maybe we swung a little too far in this direction. Maybe we do need a little bit of a stronger federal government. Before we leave the Articles of Confederation, the one biggest significant accomplishment of the Articles of Confederation, and a law that shows up a lot of times in a variety of ways on the test, it's called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which names this new chunk of territory that you can see in black on the slide here. This is like the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River where they meet. Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, right, Michigan, etc. That's called the Northwest Territory. And the Northwest Ordinance does the two things that you see on the slide. Number one, it sets up a system for orderly settlement of the land, so like a surveying and gridding system for how to buy land and how can this territory eventually become states, like it has to hit a certain population, voting population, etc. So that's one thing it does. The other thing that it does very significantly is that it specifically outlaws slavery in this territory. This is the first time that any Congress, the Articles of Confederation Congress, is making a ruling against slavery in the territories. They're like, cool, we control territories. We can say no slavery here. It's going to set a precedent that Congress will continue to use in later compromises like the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, and the Compromise of 1850, where Congress is sort of dealing with slavery in the territories. So it sets a really big precedent there that's going to become a big part of the debate leading up to the Civil War eventually. So that's the Northwest Ordinance. It's a good law to know about. But the Articles of Confederation overall not very effective. So of course we get the Constitutional Convention, the Philadelphia Convention, which we call the Constitutional Convention, and then eventually the Constitution itself. This is a good couple of key concepts to sort of pause on, take a read over, and a few specific things that you need to know. You need to know a little bit about some of the compromises that go into the Constitution. There's some that kind of highlighted in red on here are the big ones, namely compromises around the question of how we determine like the size and the election process of the legislature. We have a plan that says we should do it by population. That's the big state plan. Virginia, Massachusetts, other states with big populations back that one. And then we have a plan that says every state should have equal representation. New Jersey and Delaware, several other states that have smaller populations back that one. And so we get this compromise called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise that gives us our current setup in Congress, where we have one house that's representative and one state that's equal. So that's a big one. There's also several compromises around the question of slavery. This is an opportunity for us to write slavery out of our national story, and we do not do it. Instead, we enshrine it into the Constitution. We kick the can down the road on the slave trade. We basically say that like Congress will not make any determinants about ending the transatlantic slave trade for 20 years, which that's when we do it in 1808. And we also decide that we will count persons otherwise not represented, aka enslaved people, for representation, which will give a boost to states like Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, that have significant enslaved populations, and that is the very infamous 3/5 compromise. If you get a question where you're talking about slavery, it's good to remember that the Constitution is part of that story, and that I'm trying not to use the word ratify here, as that has a specific meaning, but we're sort of confirming the existence, constitutionalizing the existence of slavery as an institution in the country here. The other sort of big debates mostly revolve around this question of like, who has the most power in any given situation? Is it the federal government and they have sort of the supreme deciding power, or do states have that power, right? Can states like overrule or veto the federal government? That's a debate that really continues to this day. It's at the heart of a lot of our modern political debates, as it has been in pretty much every era of American history. Features of the Constitution, again, hopefully this is familiar from civics or gov. Examples of, again, smaller Republican ideals in action. We have a strong central government with 3 branches or divided powers, checks and balances between the branches. We have federalism, which is where the government is divided between federal and then state and local. I regret to inform you that there are a bunch of different uses of federalism. We have this word here, federalism, a description of a system of government. We're also going to have the Federalists in just a second, which is a term for people who support the Constitution. And then we will have another group that calls themselves the Federalists, one of our first 2 political parties, and those are all slightly different. I am very sorry. It's not great. Speaking of the Federalists, you need to know a little bit about the debate to ratify the Constitution. All right, as soon as the Constitutional Convention is done, they all sign it, or don't sign it, some of them don't sign it, get on their horses, right, ride back home, present this sort of new Constitution that nobody really knew they were writing, and the states now have to ratify it, right? We need a certain fraction of the states to ratify, nine I think, of the 13 states to ratify, not all of them. Federalist is the term for supporters of the Constitution, like, yes, this is good, we need a stronger federal government, that's where the name comes from. And then you have the anti-federalists, who preferred to call themselves the old patriots, who basically are like, no, this is too strong, right? These are people who liked that the Articles of Confederation had a weak federal government and that states had more control, and they are only willing to ratify the Constitution on the promise that the first thing that the new government will do is add a Bill of Rights that will protect the rights of the people from the government, not from each other, right, but the rights of people from the government, right, from government overreach, and that is basically the first thing that the first Congress is going to do, is to start writing these, the Bill of Rights that eventually get added in 1791. So the new dawning of the United States under the Constitution begins in 1789. That is the year the Constitution is ratified, and it's the year that George Washington is elected as our first president. And the first 2 presidencies under Washington and Adams, so from 1789 to 1800, are known as the Federalist era. Sorry, again, Washington is not a Federalist. He is not political party affiliated, but Adams is a Federalist, and Washington was very influenced by Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of Treasury, who was a Federalist. So if you sort of looked at a lot of Washington's political decisions and you tried to assign a political party to them, he would be most aligned with the Federalists, even though he never claimed or wanted to be a part of any political party. This early political stuff is often very confusing for students, and this is a good set of notes to go back and look over. It's just been a long time since we talked about this, and it's not very sticky stuff. It's not stuff that people tend to remember very easily. I tried to pull from the key concepts what I would consider kind of some main terms or some main hits. If you can kind of look at this slide and you remember everything that is on here pretty well, you could give me a basic definition, then you're probably in pretty good shape as far as how much you need to know. We're going to hit on some of this a little bit of detail. You don't need to get into too much more detail than this. But you can see that we're hitting some basic categories here: diplomacy and foreign affairs, conflicts with Native Americans, which is the Northwest Indian Wars that continue throughout both of these presidencies, in Ohio mostly, domestic policy. Remember, domestic is at home, so policy inside of the new United States, and then domestic conflict, the Whiskey Rebellion being the primary example there. So, in some more detail, lots of this President Washington era stuff comes from the financial plan that his Secretary of Treasury, our buddy Alexander Hamilton, has to try to get the country back onto sort of like, stable financial footing. We owe a whole bunch of money, like the states are in debt at different levels. There's no kind of like centralized federal treasury or anything like that. So Hamilton comes out with this financial plan as a bunch of proposals that are all put to Congress. Some of them are accepted and then some of them are rejected. For example, Hamilton is the first to propose that Congress should have protective tariffs, right? Tariffs that would help American businesses by making foreign goods more expensive. But that is rejected here in, I think, 1791, because we don't really have enough of manufacturing representation in Congress yet to consider this a good thing. We'll get there under Henry Clay, but we're not there yet. So that's an example of something that was rejected. But most of Hamilton's plans are accepted, and most of them are going to cause problems down the line. In no particular order on here, Hamilton proposes a tax on whiskey, which was something that a lot of Americans were distilling, like corn farmers would distill from their corn, their extra corn crop. The whiskey tax is what is going to eventually lead to the Whiskey Rebellion, and the putting down of the Whiskey Rebellion, when we have this rebellion of corn farmers in western Pennsylvania against this government tax, that Washington like rides out at the head of the not the Continental Army, the United States Army at this point, and very easily puts that rebellion down. And the Whiskey Rebellion is often used in contrast with Shays' Rebellion to show that, like, under the Articles of Confederation, we had Shays' Rebellion and we couldn't put that down. The government wasn't strong enough to put that down. But now, under the new, constitutional government, we have this Whiskey Rebellion, and the government like easily suppressed this. So this shows that like the Constitution works and a stronger central government is good, right? So that's one thing that comes out of Hamilton's financial plan. Other thing, biggest thing probably, is this is the beginning of the national bank, which will haunt you for the next like 50 years in discussing this class through Andrew Jackson. This is the first version of the national bank. We're going to have a couple. The idea of the national bank is that it will both be like a private business that people can invest in, right, like a shareholder company, and also it will be controlled by the government, and it will hold like the federal reserves, basically, like it'll hold like the government's money as well, and that it will help bind the sort of wealthy and powerful in support of this new government. That's kind of like Hamilton's vision, essentially. But this kicks off a whole constitutional debate about the Constitution that we literally just wrote like several years earlier, right? Specifically, this question of like, is the national bank constitutional? Doesn't say in the Constitution that Congress can create a national bank, but it doesn't say they can't either. It says they can like regulate commerce and a bunch of other things that kind of imply that they can maybe make a bank, but it doesn't say they can make a bank. So what we're going to get out of this is a debate that leads to the creation of the first two political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, with the Federalists, headed by Hamilton and John Adams, basically arguing that a strong central government needs to be able to interpret the Constitution very broadly, and they need to be able to include implied powers, not just the specific list of things in the Constitution, but a more broad list of implied powers, the national bank sort of chief amongst them. The opposing position to that, mostly articulated by Thomas Jefferson and his cohort James Madison, both from Virginia, is that no, this is like an overreach of power. We just wrote the Constitution a few years ago. This isn't in there. And the federal government should be limited to only enumerated powers, only the things that are directly in the Constitution. So Federalists, broad powers, Democratic Republicans, narrow. The really nice thing about the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, by the way, our first two political parties, is they are directly opposite on everything. So you only have to memorize one, and the other one is just the opposite on everything. It's not always the way with political parties, but it is in this case. So this is all sort of going on, this big turmoil during Washington's first and second term. At the end of Washington's second term, he does something unprecedented since he's the first president. He decides to step down and not to run for re-election, which he probably would have won again. He was still quite popular. He gives his very famous farewell address where he makes two big points. Number one, he says that we should stay neutral, like not involve ourselves in foreign affairs, not get involved in essentially the war that was beginning to be ongoing between France and Great Britain in this time period as the French Revolution has kicked off. And then also, he says that we should not form political parties. Both of those things are currently happening, and I think Washington is correct to be wary of them. We do not pay very much attention to either of those pieces of advice, as we can see here on this slide. So, second Federalist era president, John Adams, again, there's sort of like Adams in brief there. Adams's presidency is really dominated by foreign affairs issues, particularly this string of kind of cause effect that people always forget about. It doesn't come up that often in detail, but it is like if you do get an essay where you can talk about this, you will really set yourself apart because most people forget about this stuff. So just some reminders. The United States has sort of made peace with Great Britain, but has found itself in some conflict with France, specifically because Washington declared neutrality between Britain and France is mad because they backed us up and now we're not backing them up. It's a whole different government. They've had a revolution and they cut the head off of their king, but nonetheless, they are upset that we're not backing them up. So the United States has entered what's sometimes called the quasi-war with France. Quasi means like partial or half. It's not a declared war, but it is basically a war at sea between French naval ships that keep attacking American merchant ships. So to try to resolve this, we send over some American ministers to France. They go there to try to meet with the French foreign minister, a guy named Talleyrand. And when they get there, the French are like, "Oh, you want to meet with our foreign minister? Well, we would like you to pay us some money for the privilege of meeting with our foreign minister." I think it's like $250,000. It's a lot of money. We are very offended by this. Our diplomats get back on a ship. They come back to the United States. Word of what happens gets out in American newspaper, and there is a wave of anti-French sentiment. Like the French are trying to, get us to bribe them, and how dare they, and etc. And John Adams, a Federalist, not a fan of the French government, is pretty happy about this. He's sort of riding high. He's like, yes, I hate the French, and the people hate the French. The time is now. I'm going to pass some strict draconian laws. And so his administration pushes through the Alien and Sedition Acts. It's a series of acts all passed at the same time, so they're usually referred to together. The Alien Acts, or the Alien Enemies Act, basically gives the president, the executive branch, the power to deport any immigrant who the executive branch basically sort of deems to be anti-American or causing problems in some way. This one's made a surprising reappearance in American politics of late. That's the Alien Acts. The other one, the one that gets, I think, more attention at the time is what's called the Sedition Act, which makes it illegal to speak out against the government or the president specifically, or to call him mean names in the press, which a lot of people were doing. Specifically, we're going to see several dozen Democratic Republican journalists, kind of pro-Jefferson journalists who were critiquing the president's, actions and just the president in general, are going to be jailed for op-eds and stuff that they write in the paper. And then two representatives of the states of Kentucky and Virginia, one of them is Jefferson, the other one is Madison. They're writing anonymously. Everybody knows it's them. They point out correctly, that the Sedition Acts in particular are pretty unconstitutional. Those very much directly contravene the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights, right, the freedom of press. So they write these resolutions. They're called the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions because they're on behalf of those two states. And what they assert is that the states of Kentucky and Virginia are not going to follow these federal laws. They were passed by Congress, but we, the states of Kentucky and Virginia, we say that they're unconstitutional and we're just not going to do them. You can't make us. Haha. This is called nullification. It's a theory that asserts state supremacy over the federal government. States can veto basically federal law if they think it's unconstitutional. Not really something that we have a lot of agreement on whether that's true or not. And it doesn't wind up really being resolved here because when John Adams loses and Thomas Jefferson comes in, the Sedition Acts just get repealed, not the Alien Enemies Act, but the Sedition Acts just get repealed. But this question of federal versus state, who has the power, who can veto, can states veto federal laws, this is going to come up again when we get to Andrew Jackson, and then again in a big way when we get to the road to the Civil War. So this is this is a states' rights question that will recur. Last couple of kind of key concepts for this time period that you need to know a little bit about. One of them has to do with migration as one of the big course themes for the College Board. Basically, hopefully this is not a surprise, but basically we're moving west in this time period. During the colonial period, at the time of the American Revolution, the westward boundary of settlement was the Appalachian Mountains. I'm sort of trace that right here, right? So that's sort of where the Appalachian Mountains are. You can see it more clearly on this one over here. That was basically where our settlement stopped. In the time period of the Revolution, and especially during the critical period, we really start to cross that in what's called the Trans-Appalachian region sometimes, right across the Appalachian, and start to settle in places like Kentucky and Tennessee, which you can see have been turned into states, right? They've got enough settlement to become states by 1800, by the end of this period, and of course into territories like Ohio and Illinois and Indiana as well, although a little more slowly because there's some pretty significant native resistance there. So again, our migration is westward, and then eventually kind of west and south, as we'll talk more about in the next historical period. Last key concept for the unit, not the least, very important, has to do with like changes in regional attitudes about slavery and just in the institution of slavery in general. If you remember from previous review videos, what we're doing with slavery is we're looking at continuity and change over time, CCOT, right? Continuity and change over time, what changes, what stays the same. And so the bottom in the black is a good summary of sort of where the institution of slavery is at in the 1700s, basically, around the time of the Revolution, this sort of very early 1800s. Again, legal in all of the British colonies at the time of the Revolution, but increasingly concentrated in the South, right? Going to become more sort of identified with the South region. And then eventually, after the Revolution, we're going to start to see the first outlawings of slavery, as we talked about, by some individual states, and then by the Northwest Ordinance as well. Also, throughout the 1700s, we see slave codes continue to be passed and continue to tighten. It's a good truism of slavery that the slave codes get harsher the later and later that you go, right? By the time that we get up to the sort of door of the Civil War, we have the strictest and most restrictive slave codes like that we've had to that point, right? They just sort of keep getting worse. They're never repealing slave codes. They're only adding to them, is another way of thinking about that. Every time that there is a slave rebellion, we get a whole new slate of restrictive laws attempting to restrict like enslaved people's movements and freedoms. Other things that are down here, the First Great Awakening leads to mass conversions to Christianity. It's kind of like the beginning of the Black Church. Both the American Revolution and the Constitution have some impacts on the institution that we talked about on their respective slides as well. And we will be very much coming back to this issue in future historical periods. So thank you guys as always for your time. I will see you back here for historical period 4 in a little bit. Bye.